Good afternoon. I'm Kira Bailey, Assistant Professor in Psychology and Neuroscience and co-director of the COVID-19 course, along with Dr. Francesca Nestor in Politics and Government. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th lecture in our series. Today we will learn from Dr. Michele Nobel. Dr. Nobel is Assistant Professor of Education and Director of the Special Education Program at Ohio Wesleyan. She started her career as a public school teacher in Central Ohio, teaching K-8 students with disabilities in inclusive and self-contained classrooms. After earning her PhD from The Ohio State University, she shifted her focus to academia and has prepared and supervised pre-service intervention specialists since 2005. Her research on effective instructional strategies for at-risk and identified youth, peer tutoring, behavior analysis, and educator preparation and accreditation has been published in several peer-reviewed journals. As a reminder, you can use the chat function to ask questions throughout the presentation. I will select questions for Dr. Nobel to answer. You can also continue your discussions on the COVID-19 course Facebook group. And now, how the pandemic has exposed what's great and not so great in our public schools.
Hey there, everybody. Let's get started. Oh, maybe not. There we go. All right. So first, I just want to say a little bit about my discipline. My background is in special education. And so I would say all of us in education have lots of questions about COVID-19 and what it means for us in public schools. So today, though, I'm going to give a broad strokes, what are the purposes of public education and how might COVID-19 be affecting and impacting those purposes. Look a little bit into school closures and pandemics of the past and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in public schools right now in the middle of this COVID-19 closure. And then with every challenge comes opportunity. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So for those of you who don't really have a background in education, I just want to give you a really broad overview of what the history of schooling is here in the United States and talk a little bit about the major drivers for reform. So when we see changes in public schools, they're generally either legislated or litigated. And so in more recent history in this country, we've really been struggling with access to public education. And so we see a lot of that in the civil rights movement. And we're also working toward quality of what's happening in our public schools. And so you'll see that along legislated and litigated lines across the field. Oops. So the thing that we're really focusing on right now in public schools, we're really interested in making sure that we have an engaged and educated citizenry. And so when we look at things that are a little bit more recent in the 20th and 21st century, we're really looking at a shift from individuals to the holistic picture of the child in all aspects, not just your traditional academics, your reading, writing, arithmetic kinds of things, but we're really looking at all aspects of child and adolescent development. So when we think about that and we think about the things that are happening right now with COVID-19, that's a big impact. We see schools that are geographically and based in neighborhoods, and we're used to having students and families come and go from those really central hubs. And with a pivot to online, we're not doing that. And so it makes a lot of those community-based, community-immersed services and experiences really challenging for families. So I know in the early days of March, I was spending a lot of time saying, this is unprecedented. I feel like this is unprecedented. But really, school at home isn't as unprecedented as we might think. We do have schools that close for natural disasters. So think about all of the schools that were displaced or temporarily closed for things like the California wildfires, or even big natural disasters like Katrina. So we've seen that. We've seen schools make shifts, extend school years, move. But what's really unprecedented is the scale of COVID-19. We aren't just talking about regions or states, we're talking about everybody. And that move makes it really, really feel unprecedented. One of the things that I've been most excited about, if you can be excited about everything that's happening right now, is the way that educators and anyone who works in schools has really just risen to this challenge, right? We've done this before, and when things get hard, teachers roll up their sleeves and get it done. And so it's been really awesome to watch that happening and to look back and see where it's happened before. And so kind of to piggyback on some of the previous COVID-19 lectures and panels that we've had, I went back to the 1918 influenza pandemic as well and looked at that time period and looked to see what were schools doing. So we had the influenza pandemic, we had tuberculosis and measles, we also had World War I happening during that time. And so schools made shifts. They went to open air schools. We started to see medical personnel present in the school, so school nurses coming about in this time period in a response to care and concern for children's health, right? And then if you jump ahead a little bit into the Great Depression, we still have tuberculosis, we still have polio on the scene, and we have challenging economic hardship. And schools' responses there, teachers taught without pay. I'm not sure that would happen today, but it did happen in the Great Depression. We rolled up our sleeves, we got the work done. So we saw some schools close. We saw consolidations, which we probably are going to see a little bit as we move forward after COVID-19 or during COVID-19. And we saw some rolling closures due to illness as well. When we jump to World War II, we see a shift in the workforce of schools. Not that teachers weren't teaching, but now teachers were taking on the roles of administration. So we had a shift of women moving into more positions of power in the public school in a response to war effort. And we also start to see the federal government making some shifts. And so this is where we start to see some low cost childcare and some preschool opportunities for families that were subsidized so that women could go into the workforce. One of the biggest places that we see changes in the public schools happened in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And some of you on the call lived through those eras like the rest of us and remember some of these things. Court mandated desegregation of schools. All of those things that we were working so hard for around protected classes and getting access to public education. And my field of special education, this is a big area for us too. The first special education laws coming about in this time to guarantee that folks with disabilities had a right to education just like everyone else. And so we continue to work on these areas, but we see schools really working through those unprecedented times. And then another thing that's going to be important as we continue on in our conversation will be school reform in the 21st century and something called community schools. And so this is, again, that idea that the school is the hub of a neighborhood. And it's not just there to educate children, but it's there to provide services for families and kind of a back and forth. And so you can see in the graphic, we have schools that are serving not just as academic centers, but as support centers for medical, for food, for all things that folks may need to get through hard times. And so the nice thing about community schools and the way they're designed is they're well positioned and they're already embedded in the community. So during a crisis like COVID-19, we're able to quickly shift and utilize those networks and community schools to provide for the community. And so that becomes important as we continue our conversation today. So I think another thing that we think about when we're wondering about COVID-19 and school closures is really, are they effective? Should we have done this? Should we have closed all of our schools? the short answer is yes, we should have. But how effective is that really? So for COVID-19, as all of our previous talks have mentioned, the data are still very new, and we haven't had a chance to really unpack and dig through that yet. So the jury's a little bit still out, but we can look at some of the school closure data from other pandemics, even though they're influenza, and take note of things that we've seen there. So one that I've pulled out for you is a 2014 review done by the United Kingdom's Department of Health, and they were trying to improve school closure and school preparedness for influenza pandemics. And so they noticed that if they closed schools early in the outbreak, that was effective. It reduced the peak. And if children had higher attack rates than adults, then that school closure was most effective. And then another review in 2018 found similar things, right? Reduced peak, delayed peak. And then in 2020, we started looking at not just school closure, but school closure combined with things like social distancing. And those really have some really compelling evidence for us to consider. We see the reduced transmission, but some of those studies also followed when we returned to school, and we see a surge, which is important for us to consider. Again, this is influenza. And the literature really is inconsistent about when is the best time to close and when is the best time to reopen, which is what we really want the answers to right now. And then additional findings are things that we're currently living in, right? We have some tough economic times coming ahead. We know that we have children that are not doing well during this closure. And so we're seeing all of those things in the literature as well. So we know that COVID-19 is different. It's not influenza, right? So the school closure may be less effective, but when we start to kind of unpack some of that information, we do see that school closure does have an impact. What's interesting is when you look at China, their schools were closed already because they were closed for the Chinese New Year. And so it's hard to say for sure whether or not that closure made a difference because they weren't in school at the time. So if we shift a little bit and look at coronaviruses, particularly if we look at SARS, there really isn't any information to suggest that schools were transmission sites, which is really interesting. We do know that schools closed. So in Hong Kong, they did close schools, and we really didn't see any evidence that SARS was being transmitted in the school settings. When we did the tracing there, we were able to really go back to family settings and apartments and things like that. So we also know that Singapore closed and did like a big 3-week shutdown of everything school related, and then opened back up using some of the containment strategies that we're starting to hear now around temperature checks and things like that. So it's interesting to look at those things and consider how that information might inform our reopening of public schools here in the United States. Another interesting study is kind of an accidental study. So Seattle, 2019, they actually had a weather closure. And so they were closed for 5 days. But in the population in Seattle at the time, they had coronavirus and they had 2 strands of influenza. And so they were able to say that school closure did make a difference in both the transmission of coronavirus and to some degree the influenza. And so those things are important to keep in mind. Looking at some modeling and some actual early COVID-19 data, in the United Kingdom, some of the modeling that they did around COVID-19 found that school closure alone wasn't enough. And so they were looking at, well, what's going to be more effective? So if we're only doing one thing, then case isolation is more effective. But if we're going to go with a packaged approach, so school closures and social distancing and possibly what we're living right now, that really did prove to be most effective in the models. So we know that school closure alone isn't enough. So even though school closure is painful and hard for all of us, it isn't enough by itself when we're dealing with something like a novel coronavirus. And so that's really important for us to keep in mind. In Hong Kong, we're seeing the social distancing piece a little bit more effective in reducing community transmission than school closures. And so again, huge cautions here. The data that we're starting to get from COVID-19, and particularly the things that I was looking at for related to school closures, those are preprint articles. And so for those of you who haven't been around academics for a while, I'll just remind you that preprint means it hasn't gone through peer review. And so it's important for us to get our hands on that data so we can start to analyze it and think about it and look for replication. But we also know that it hasn't been through a fully vetted process. And so we always want to have caution when we're looking at information from the COVID-19 information that's coming out right now. We can look at other coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS. Those things that are published have been through peer review. And so from a school closure perspective, there's really not much information that we can glean about when do we close, when do we reopen. And likewise, there's not a lot of information that we have around did the temperature monitoring, is that the direction to go? Do we need to mask our students? Is that the direction we should go? The literature isn't going to help us very much with that. And so some of our early conclusions about COVID-19 and closing schools, we can say that it contributed to a reduced transmission of COVID-19, particularly when we look in places like China. We don't really have much evidence right now around national school closures alone as something that would be effective. And we also need to consider that when we do close schools, just like when we shut down all of our businesses, there's some really profound economic and social consequences for students in that area. And so those are all big concerns. So from a policy perspective, what does all of this mean? Well, school closure is a pretty common sense method when we're looking at diseases like influenza. And so, we've probably all heard on the news, hey, this district is closed for 3 days. There's an influenza outbreak and we're gonna do a lot of cleaning, 3 days off, right? So we know that that's effective. But when we look at COVID-19, we really have mixed information about school closure, and particularly school closure alone. And so that is something that we need to be careful about when we start making sweeping changes and putting policies in place. We also need to think about when we go back to school that we may have high rates of staff absence. And that may be because staff are becoming ill, but it also may be because staff don't feel safe to come back. And so what will schools do in those cases? We've all been watching the news, and so you've heard a lot about schools and daycares and the need for those as people return to work. And so we do have pandemic daycares here in Ohio, but we're under really heavy pressure to roll back into some kind of a normal for our students, and definitely around daycares so that folks can return to the workforce. And so we need to be thinking about strategies for how we roll that out and how we're careful in that rollout. And then anything that happens on a national or even a regional level has implications for our local schools. And so really thinking about those things becomes important as we move forward. So we did close school. So I know that I am one of many of you who is working from home and has also become my children's teacher, and that's been hard. And so this experience has really exposed a lot of the things that are awesome about public schools, but also the things that are some of our greatest challenges. And so I will say, as other folks have talked about, particularly the Monday panel, talking specifically about inequities in healthcare and how we have concerns for certain individuals and those and groups, and this isn't new. We see that in our public schools as well. So we know that our students, some of them have tough home environments, and we know that some of them go to schools that are not equal and not equitable compared to other schools. And so We know that there are some strong correlates for geography and race and socioeconomic status that allow us to be able to say that some schools are resource poor compared to other schools that are resource rich. And so those are challenges that are not new. And anyone who's worked in education knows about this and has struggled with it for a long time. But COVID-19 has really pushed these things into the forefront. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those issues specifically and what has been great about them, but also what is not so great about them. And so the first one is access to food. And we have a future COVID-19 lecture coming up talking about food. So we won't talk too much about this one, but the thing that's great about schools is we've already responded to food insecurity. And so we have schools that already have food pantries on site. We have schools that already send weekend food bags home. And most schools have a way to deliver food in the summer. So I'm in the Columbus City School District, and Columbus does a great job with all of these areas, like most schools do, because there's a need and schools will try to fill it. And so some of the great things that we've seen around food access, we've been able to keep our cafeteria workers working, preparing meals, and we've had some bus drivers even going out and delivering the food on their routes. That's amazing stuff. We've had a lot of grab and go options where folks can either walk to a central location or drive to a central location and pick up food. And we also had federal guidelines that were adjusted fairly quickly to allow for the free and reduced breakfast and lunch programs to be reallocated to do some of this grab and go and food delivery. And those things are amazing and super important. But on the not so great side, we know that we missed families. So if I'm in a district that has a grab and go and I have a family member who's undocumented, I may not want to go pick up food, even though I need it, because I'm exposed. Same for folks who are homeless. They may just not be able to access the food. And if I'm in a district that's not able to deliver it to me, or I don't have a stable residence, it might be hard for the district to find me. And so that's a concern. We already have a lot of food insecurity amongst our public school population. That's going to get worse. We're moving towards tough economic times. And so we're going to see continued challenges around access and need for food. Another big one, and one of the things that hit me first, food, I was nervous about right away when we went to close. School safety came up next for me, because we know that we have a good portion of students that when they're at school, they're safe. And so it's been really nice to see the educational community rally around and find really creative ways to continue to check in with students and families that we know have tough situations at home. But on the not so great side, we had all of these things set up in our community school hub. And that was disrupted until we could figure out how to deliver some of those services in a remote learning environment. And some of them we haven't figured out really yet. And that's a huge concern. We also know that we're sending students to places where their living conditions aren't great. So they may be in small apartments or cramped quarters, and now everyone is home. And you're expected to do your work remotely. And possibly the other folks in your household are doing that as well. And so it just makes things really challenging to deal with. We know that we have 2.5% of students that are in public schools that don't have a stable residence. And in some areas, that percentage is going to be higher. If we look at a place that's been hit particularly hard with COVID-19, New York City, we see 1 in 10 students are housing insecure. And so that is a huge concern when you're fighting a pandemic and you don't have safe and stable housing. It's hard to go home when home is dangerous. And we have portions of our student population that we serve. Think about students who are LGBTQIA+, where home isn't a safe place for them to be. We also have issues of domestic violence and things like that. And those are issues that people don't like to think about, but those things happen, and now we're sending students to an unsafe situation. And in some cases, we as educators know that that's happening, and that's been really hard to think about, and there's no great solution for those things. But we're doing the best we can to try to keep students safe. Another huge issue is technology. And sometimes you'll hear this called the digital divide. We know that we have a good portion of students that either have limited or no technology access. And so some of the great things that we've been able to do, schools have been able to disperse equipment. They've been able to share mobile hotspots. One that I really like is taking Wi-Fi accessible buses and parking them out in neighborhoods so that students can use the Wi-Fi from the bus. I like that one. It's very creative. We did have some providers offering some free internet, but when you unpacked that a little bit, it turned out that if you owed them money, then you couldn't access the free internet. And so schools quickly tried to work with families who were in those situations and the providers to try to bridge that gap. Any school that was a one-to-one device school, which means they have one device for every student, they were able to very quickly deploy. Same for schools that had banks of or classroom sets of Chromebooks. And so districts were able to move those devices quickly out to families, which is great. Teachers who were already Google educators or schools who were already using the Google platform were able to very quickly shift, because if they had already been using that in kind of a blended learning environment, it was a lot easier for those schools to be able to just say, okay, now you're just logging into your Google Classroom every day. And so that was a really great thing for a lot of our schools. And then things like Zoom and Google Meet and video conference abilities. Teaching is really a people business. And so it's nice for students and teachers to be able to see themselves. When my students that I live with had been on break for a couple of weeks, those first video calls, the joy in their faces and their voices was just, it was awesome. And so being able to do that and to have this COVID-19 crisis happen at a time when we do have this technology available to us is so awesome and helpful. But on the not so great side, not everyone came and picked up devices. The quality of the digital learning, when we look across all districts, varies widely. There are huge challenges about how to deal with some of our most vulnerable students, students that are English language learners, students with disabilities, in some cases our homeless population. It's really unclear how we're providing accommodations in this remote learning situation. And it's been very challenging, and we're still trying to figure it out in a lot of cases. Students that live on tribal lands or in really remote communities don't have great access to broadband, and having the device isn't enough. This really pushes the conversation about, is internet access a right, a human right? This really pushes it, because if you didn't have access, you were in a lot of trouble in a remote learning situation. So this issue is so big, it gets 2 slides. So more things that are great. And this is a personal one for me. I think that the experience with remote teaching should lead us into more blended learning when we return to face-to-face instruction. And that will create more engaging and interactive experiences for students. And I think that's going to be one of the great things that happens here. Likewise, being kind of forced to look at what's available to me in an online learning environment and look at those materials, I think is a good thing. And then all of the things that were made available for teachers, free access, that was amazing. And at some level, I'm not sure how we would have done some of the things as quickly as we did without folks offering some of those services for free. Again, on the not so great side, if you are living in one of those situations where you've got a lot of folks on some really questionable internet, those slow, unstable connections, you get kicked offline a few times, you're going to give up and you're going to not want to be in your remote learning classroom anymore. And that's hard. We do know there are circumstances as well where we have one device and 3, 4 siblings trying to use it, maybe also sharing with a parent. Those situations are difficult for everyone to get their work accomplished. And then, of course, we have teachers who are not tech savvy and have been able to just kind of say, well, I'm just not good with technology. But this pivot to remote learning meant that they couldn't really say that anymore, and they just had to figure it out. And that is very challenging and very stressful for educators, because no teacher wants to just not do well and not support their students. So that's a very difficult thing that we had to try to overcome and overcome quickly. I was talking about the shift earlier to this holistic support for students. And so some of the good things that have happened, the video connection allows me to see students. It allows me to see how they're doing. It allows me to reconnect. If we had a great relationship when we were face-to-face, I can continue that quickly in the online environment. And we also had teams of teachers and other school administrators and staff who were able to find out, who haven't you seen? Which families have you not connected with? And then we sent teams out to go check and see, is there an urgent need? Is there a resource we can get? And so those things were really important. And it's impressive how quickly schools were able to do that. The not so great side of that, sometimes the online and asynchronous is just really a poor substitute for all of the things that we had in place to support students in a holistic way. The emotionally draining process that has been the COVID-19 pivot has been really hard for teachers. And the trauma that we will see for both teachers and students as we return is going to be something that we're going to need to talk about and put some supports in place for. And then as our economy continues to be in a bit of a crisis, we know that we're going to have students that are on the edge, on the margins, that are going to need more support. And some that were on the margins but were doing well before the COVID-19 shift, we may see them kind of fall into an area where they need more support. And that's going to be challenging. Issue 5, access to high quality instruction. So one of the things that's controversial about schools is some of all the high stakes testing and things like that. We don't have time for that conversation today, but a great thing that happened was a quick response from the state, and in some cases from the Fed, about waivers and shifts and adjustments so that we could finish up the year in a COVID-19 closure and things would still be relatively okay for students as far as completing grade levels and graduating. So I think another thing that will happen is that we've forced teachers to use some educational technology that maybe they just didn't want to use, myself included in some degrees. And so those things are going to be good for improving our instruction as we move forward. And another thing I want to point out is some students actually are performing better in this COVID-19 closure, whether that's they have more choice, it's self-paced. It may be that they're able to focus because they're at home and there's not much else they can do. Maybe it's the less pressure, the removal of some of those high stakes tests. Maybe they're getting more sleep. In my house, we're getting less sleep, so I'm not sure about that one. And it could just be the change in the social dynamics to being more at home. So there's lots to think about as far as what's been good for students. On the not so great side, everyone was overwhelmed by this transition, and we know that some of the lessons we developed aren't great, and we know that the workload is still out of balance. We know that we have students who are doing more than just being students at home. They may be running households, taking care of folks, working. We know that we have gaps typically we talk about the summer slide where we have gaps between students in low socioeconomic status compared to higher socioeconomic status. And we know that that gap widens in their academics over the summer. And now we're starting to hear people talk about the COVID-19 slide. So we're going to see bigger gaps there. And another thing that's really interesting is, if you'll remember, we originally said we were going to close for 3 weeks. And so in that 3-week closure, some districts decided they weren't going to do anything for 3 weeks, and some sent packets home thinking, you know, it's like a blizzard bag closure. But once that became a more extended closure, school districts had to adjust quickly. And just to put this out for some of you who are thinking, why would districts do nothing? Districts have to be able to meet the equal access requirements. And so if I'm a district that's not sure how I'm going to be able to provide instruction for students with disabilities, then my choice might be to do nothing, because that way we don't have the haves and the have-nots. We have no one doing anything. In a short term, that may have seemed like a good solution, but once we moved into a more extended closure, that couldn't continue. Access to teachers and other educational personnel, things that were great. And anyone who's been on social media hopefully has seen teachers really rallying together, creating collectives so they can bounce ideas off each other. Schools have been doing videos of encouragement. It's been amazing to watch teachers just say, this is what we're doing, let's do it. And let's rally around each other and support each other. And whole communities doing the same thing. Then not so great, we haven't been able to replace everyone. So parent volunteers, tutors, mentors, folks that were coming into the schools, we haven't been able to replace all of those folks. And so that access has been limited. And in some cases, some of our educational specialists, that's true as well. And something that's really stark for me is when you're in a district that's privileged, it was business as usual. That pivot was easier than it was for some of our more challenged districts. And that was really hard to watch. And then finally, issue 7, there was a little bit of delay from both the federal and the state departments of education around some guidance and waivers. And so it's great that we were able to get it done, but it's not so great that some of that rolled out late. Some of it was inconsistent or incomplete. And now something coming that's not so great is we've cut education funding here in Ohio. And so we know that we're going to have more guidance, and let's hope it's not delayed. So as I said, these aren't new issues. COVID-19 just spotlighted these issues. And for some people who hadn't experienced them, maybe it made it more relevant. So with challenge comes change and opportunity. So big picture, we have a chance to really work on real solutions here. So, and we've heard in a couple of lectures before, I don't want to go back to normal, I want to go back to better. And I'm going to say the same thing here as well. These issues are not new, but this might be the place where we have a pivot point to make a difference. So what do we want schools to do, and how are we going to fund them in an equitable way? Can we right-size teacher ratios? So the rollout for our preschools and our early childcare centers is a 9-to-1 ratio, or I think it's 6-to-1 for infants. Can we right-size some of our issues with older students as well? Possibly. How are we going to bridge these resource gaps, right? How can we be creative and do those things? How can we recruit and retain the highest quality teachers for all schools? And how can we use the networks that we see in community schools to respond not just in crisis, but just to respond to building communities that we want to see? At the federal and state level, we need our state to be prepared and to identify the things that we have and the things that we need, and to partner with the federal government to make resources available to us so that we can bridge gaps that we see that have been spotlighted by COVID-19. We need to think about this lost learning for everyone, but particularly for some of our most vulnerable student populations. How are we going to bridge these gaps? And what can we do at the federal and the state level to support our local schools? And I would say we need all stakeholders in the conversation. So we need the voices of children and families at the table just as much as other policymakers. And we need to think about our response now, but we also need to think about the future. And so again, from a little bit higher standpoint, should we use school closures? I think we should when we need to control disease and we think it's going to be effective. But we need to really look at all of these issues that have been spotlighted and consider the long-term effects of things like social, economic, and health inequities for our children, and try to bridge those gaps before we have the next huge school closure. And so I would call for real reform now. We need to craft a nimble system that's responsive, that works for every child. We need to take the best parts of the remote learning environment and what we've learned in COVID-19 and pair them with what we know to be great in our place-based schools. We really need to look at how we target our education for students that need gaps to be closed, and not just academic, but social, trauma, holistic supports for students. And we need to leverage some legislators to help us out. We know that families are hurting. And so what can we do to support income? What can we do in legislated change to support families to help in this time of great crisis? And so I've listened to a lot of the lectures week to week. And one of the questions is always, what can I do? Well, here's some things you can do. Practical things. Learn about school issues. Be an informed citizen. Attend, or you can view online, school board meetings. Read from a variety of places. Look at both sides of issues and think critically about what you hear and what you see and what you read. Follow social media. There are lots of good outlets. Almost every school has some kind of social media outlet. Follow all of those so that you know exactly what's good in schools and also what they need, because sometimes they post about that as well. Find a network. There are tons of advocacy groups. Whatever's important to you, go find that group. If you're a parent, join your PTO or your PTA and work to change your school culture and environment, and then take action. Write, call, meet with your state reps at all levels and talk to them about what's great about schools, but also what schools need. Volunteer at your school. Every school has a need for folks to work with classes and to work with students who need a little extra support. And most importantly, get out there and vote. And so I'll leave you with this quote. We have a lot to consider and a lot to think about, and COVID-19 might be the thing that we needed to make real actionable change in our public schools. And I hope all of you are thinking about what little piece you can do to help make a change for our students. And with that, I'm going to stop screen share. And we can hopefully take some awesome questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nobel. That was amazing. That was so much information about really important issues. And I think that I love that you gave us what was great as well as the challenges that are ahead, because I think right now it can be so easy to focus on those challenges and not realize that we are actually doing some things well. And so I kind of want to start with that question. The audience had questions about what data we have on what's worked and what hasn't. So we know that not every student has had the same opportunities and resources to learn. And schools have made a variety of choices about whether to grade them or not grade them. And so how are we collecting evidence for what has worked and what hasn't so that we can use that to make decisions moving forward?
So it's a good question. And I would say we probably don't have a uniform way that we're collecting that information. I would say at this point, each school and each district is really kind of doing their own thing and kind of collecting their own information. And I think it will be important for folks that work in policy, our administrators, folks that work at Department of Education, but also folks like me and my colleagues in universities, to look and to dig and to survey and to talk to people, and to see what were your responses to COVID-19? How did you make adaptations? And what are we seeing in the short term and in the long term? Some of the things that we're going to need, we're not going to have right away. For example, so we've made a lot of changes. It's going to take a couple of years to see how those changes that we've made in this spring, what are the long-term effects for those things? One thing that's great about teachers is we are really good at looking at each individual student and figuring out where they are academically, socially, what their needs are, and developing the interventions and supports that we need to bridge gaps. And so I feel confident that we'll be able to, at the local levels, be able to move students forward. But the larger questions about what does this mean for the next crisis, or what does this mean for what's effective when we do need to make a big pivot to remote learning, I think it's going to take us a while to really unpack that. And because it's not universal and everyone has done slightly different things, that's a lot of data for us to dig through. But you know, we'll do it, and then we'll be able to make some recommendations for folks.
So something you had just mentioned was how well teachers are able to identify individual student needs once you're back in the classroom. And that is a great segue into another question the audience had, which is, once we are back in regular classes, whenever that may be, how are the differences in these at-home schooling experiences going to be addressed?
Right. And so what we'll do is, you know, and possibly we might still be doing it in this remote way as well. But what we'll do is we'll do the kinds of assessments that teachers are used to doing. So all kinds of different curriculum-based assessments. And so a lot of times when people hear assessment, they think these big standardized assessments. I'm talking about very small and based on curriculum assessments. So things like having children read to you and listening to what do they do well when they read? What errors are they making? What strategies are they using well? What strategies have they forgotten? We'll look at all of their academics in that really targeted way. And that will help us see what skills they have mastered and which skills they really are struggling with. And on some level, we know that everybody, even our most privileged students, are probably going to have some gaps. They're probably going to have some things that they really didn't master. And so it will be the job of teachers to look at each student individually, do those assessments, sit down with students and talk to them about their confidence levels, how they feel about different skills, and then take all of that information and craft some learning plans. So I do have some concerns about some of the standards that we meet at every grade level, and whether or not we'll need to make some adjustments to some of those things. And I think for those of you who are educators on that are in the class today, you know, it's always a balance between what I need to get through in any given year from a content perspective and what I need to do to make sure that the students have the foundational skills to continue to move forward. And that's a balance that teachers have to figure out every year anyway. This year makes it a little harder because we do have students who haven't been engaged at all, or have been engaged but at a very minimal level. And on the other side of it, we have students who are thriving, who have been able to work through everything the school asked of them and more. And so we're going to probably be in a situation where differentiated learning and tailored instruction becomes crucial for teachers for the next several years as we work to try to bring students back into kind of that range where they would have been had we not had a COVID-19 closure.
Thank you. So this was a really good question, I thought. Someone pointed out that we have spent a lot of time thinking about how do we provide the same kinds of services that we always have, just in a totally different remote environment. But have we really started to think about, maybe using the pandemic to rethink some of these services and what needs to be provided to students, or different ways that we could engage students? So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so there are things, and even in my own teaching as a university professor, there are things that I'm thinking about and saying to myself, why didn't I do this piece sooner? Why didn't I think about this academic tool? And so I think this is going to be a time when all of us, when we finish our school year and we can sit and reflect about what we have done well and what has gone well for our students, and the things that we were challenged by and our students were challenged in doing, it will allow us the opportunity to really investigate and explore and see if we can do things in a different way. We already have some movements that are not new in education, and you'll hear them, things like blended learning, which I said a couple of times, flipped classrooms. And so those things are already leveraging some technology, and they're taking these educational tools that we have, and we're having students do things in different ways. The other thing that's really nice about technology, and something that I appreciate as a special educator, is that we have a lot of software and a lot of curriculum material that we can actually individualize for students. So we can have students do placement tests, whether those are online or paper pencil, and we can place them into a certain part of a curriculum or a software program, and those things also can self-level. And so we have the opportunity, if we can get all students access to these things, we have the opportunity for students to do some self-paced work and some individualized instruction without needing more tutors, more volunteers, more people power to sit with smaller groups of students, or even one-to-one, to work on some of these gaps. And I think we're foolish if we don't take the things that have gone well for us in COVID-19. I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't change public schools and use some of the things that worked well for us. I think some of the challenges in doing that are cost related, right? Some of the things that we've been using to really triage our instruction in COVID-19 has been made available because there's no fees with some of these software programs and curricula and different platforms that we've been using. As soon as those go back to fee-based, some of our schools don't have the resources they will need to continue to use these awesome tools. And so while some of them are free, many of them are not. And once you put them in public school, you need site licenses. And so there's all of these things that we need to think about. But I don't think these are insurmountable problems. I think this is where we need to get more people at the table and think creatively and use this as an opportunity to stop making excuses for why we're not doing it, and to really say, why can't we do that? We should be doing this. Who can we get to help us? How can we leverage our funds differently? And so I think this gives us a really big pivot point for us to make some of the changes that teachers and parents and taxpayers have been asking for a long time. We have an opportunity to do that. This is a good place for us to draw that line in the sand and say, we're not going to do this anymore. It didn't work for everyone. There were a lot of inequities. How are we expecting folks to live without these kinds of resources? of course they're behind. What can we do to change that? And it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be clean, but we should be talking about it and we should be pushing harder. And I think the fact that many families watched the struggle play out in their own living rooms will give us a little bit more of a boost to be able to say, this is not right and we can do better and we should. And from a personal perspective, I'm a teacher. My husband and I both teach. Our students, our children struggled in this COVID-19 environment. We certainly are privileged, and it was a struggle for us. And so in my own reflection, thinking about how hard it was for our family to work through things, to think about people who don't have everything we have is unacceptable. We cannot just turn a blind eye and not talk about it, point it out. COVID-19 spotlighted it. It's time for us to do something about it.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. Do you foresee what's happened this school year as making online education more or less appealing to teachers, students, and parents? And we had a couple of people specifically wonder about having higher enrollment in K-12 online schools, or will there be more homeschooling next year? So what do you think about that?
I think the answer is I don't know. However, I think that we have students who did thrive in this environment. And I would say those students may be more inclined to enroll in some of the public online schools. And if I'm a student who did well, I should go leverage that kind of school opportunity. It's available. I think we're going to have some folks, and I've seen on some of the social media forums already, parents who are nervous, or any student who is immune compromised. And so certainly in my own field in special education, I think we're going to have students who it's going to be too dangerous for them to come back to school if we go back to school. And so that will either mean that they need to continue in an online kind of environment, or their families are going to need to make the tough decision to homeschool. And so I do think we're going to see portions of our population making some of those decisions. I think we have some families that have really enjoyed the experience of facilitating learning for their children. And so those folks will probably make that decision. So I think there'll be bumps in homeschool and online because of those things. But I also think that there's families like my own that really, really miss the things that we enjoyed about having our students out in public schools in a face-to-face environment. Just even getting up in the morning and going to school, right? We miss those things. And so I think there's going to be a good portion of students who will continue to seek out that more traditional face-to-face. But it's going to be interesting. And I think once we see the guidelines for what it's going to look like when we go back to school, right? We don't know what school's going to look like when we go back. And so some of those guidelines or requirements may also force families to either homeschool or do online. And one group that I'm thinking about in particular, I've seen some conversations about, well, we might need everyone to have a mask. Well, there's young children it's going to be challenging to keep masks on some of our younger students, but it's also going to be challenging to keep masks on students who have sensory issues. And so if I'm a student who already doesn't like to be touched, or I'm very sensitive to those things, wearing a mask is going to be challenging. And so we may have some folks who make decisions because of those kinds of things and how they are rolled out to families.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nobel, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. And I want to thank everyone who's here for asking excellent questions. Don't forget that you can continue the conversation on the Facebook group. Another way to continue the conversation is in the Meet the Prof sessions. Students who have registered for the course can join us tomorrow at 4 p.m. in Blackboard Collaborate. Community members can join us at noon on Friday in Blackboard Collaborate. RSVP links will be sent in an email, and if you have any questions, don't forget you can contact us at covidcoursecoordinator@owu.edu. We'll see you again soon.